Gardevoir EX is a new card from the Scarlet and Violet expansion, and it is one of the most powerful cards released in a long time. Today, we're going to talk about Gardevoir EX, its how you can build it, and why the deck is so good. This is the complete matchup guide and the complete guide for Gardevoir EX for all players coming into the Pokemon trading card game. If you guys enjoy this kind of content, please like and subscribe. And without further ado, I'll jump right in, and today, I'll be your guide. My name is Rahul Reddy, and welcome to the YouTube channel. Gardevoir EX is a card from the Scarlet and Violet expansion that is a Stage 2 Pokemon with 310 HP. It's a Psychic-type Pokemon with the ability Psychic Embrace, which is why the card is so good. Psychic Embrace states, as often as you'd like during your turn, you may attach a basic Psychic Energy card from your discard pile to one of your Psychic Pokemon. If you attach an energy to a Pokemon in this way, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. You can't use this ability on a Pokemon that would be knocked out. Its attack for 2 Psychics and a colorless is Miracle Force, 190, and recovers all special conditions. It's weak to the Dark type and has resistance to fighting by 30. It does have 2 retreat, and it does have the rule box EX, which says that when your Pokemon EX is knocked out, your opponent takes 2 prize cards. This card, paired with the Gardevoir from Chilling Reign that has Shining Arcana, which says once during your turn you may look up the top 2 cards of your deck and attach any number of basic energy cards you find there and put them into your hand, is a deadly combination, as Brainwave is also an attack that says 60 plus 30 for each Psychic Energy attached to this Pokemon. Now, if you're doing the math correctly, Psychic Embrace allows you to attach 6 energies from your discard without knocking your Gardevoir out. That brings us to a grand total of 240 damage. This has become a deadly combination that even catapulted Tor Reklev to a 2nd place finish at the European International Championships. We're going to talk about why this is so powerful and look at the skeleton list. This is a general skeleton list for anyone who is looking to play the deck. 3 Ralts with Teleportation Burst, the 70 HP is very relevant in a lot of matchups, and being able to bounce back to your bench is a talent of its own. 1 Memory Skip Ralts is a great option to have, especially with Alolan Vulpix GX just winning an international. The Curlier that has Refinement is the best card for this deck, as it lets you discard a card from your hand and draw up to 2 cards, therefore thinning some of the worst cards in your deck, or putting Psychic Energies into the discard, while also building your hand up to make big plays. 2 Gardevoir EX is a must, as it is the cornerstone of your deck, but you do not need more than 1 Shining Arcana Gardevoir if that is how your deck operates. You need at least 1 copy of Zacian V, which has the exact same attack as Brainwave for 3 colorless energies and does the exact same thing, 60 plus 30 for each Psychic attached. However, Zacian V has a little bit more HP at 220, which will allow your Gardevoir to attach up to 10 Psychic Energies from the discard to this Pokemon, giving you a monstrous amount of damage. Radiant Greninja helps you cycle through your deck, as well as put these Psychic Energies into the discard, which is a asset that this deck really needs to use. You obviously want to play 1 copy of Judge, as well as a copy of Roxanne for the late game, and a Boss's Orders to gust up some cards. Now, you may note that in this skeleton list there aren't as many supporters as you thought there would be, but that's because there's so many different flavors to the deck, some playing heavier copies of Judge, and niche supporters like Arven, Worker, Miriam, and some playing heavier copies of Research, and also playing copies of cards like Miriam, Clara. So any supporter can really work in this deck as long as you pick your draw supporter of choice and commit to that line. I'm personally a fan of the Professor Research build, but I know some players had a lot of success with the Judge build. 4 copies of Battle VIP Pass seems to be the absolute gold standard to find your Pokemon on turn 1. 3 Level Ball, 3 Fall Crystal, and 3 Ultra Ball are kind of the standard as well to find the other pieces of your deck, but some opt to go up to 4 Level or 4 Fog Crystal to just make those pieces kind of flow a little bit easier. Battle VIP Pass might not be the best card in the deck after turn 1, but with Curlier's Refinement, you can put that card into the discard with no problem. 1 copy of Palpad has become staple in these decks as well, because there are a couple of one-off supporters like Roxanne or Boss's Orders that you might want to recycle towards the end of the game. Sky Seal Stone is a card that pairs well with Zacian V to take an extra prize on V Maxes or V Stars, as Zacian V is typically the only V Pokemon that you'll be playing in the deck. Using Zacian V in that combination can seal up a game pretty early, or start the game with a bang against a deck like Lugia V-Star or Mew V-Max. With 1 Temple of Sinnoh at the very minimum, the deck needs to use that to mitigate the damage that Lugia V-Star can do to this deck, and 10 Psychic Energies seems to be the baseline for a deck like this. We're going to talk about which one of 2 ways you can go. Straight Gardevoir and Mewtwo V-Union are the 2 ways that have become most popularized with the new deck. In a straight Gardevoir build, decks opt to play Rare Candy to kind of get to your Gardevoir pieces much quicker, keep those Curlias in play to continue to use trade. There's a heavier Gardevoir line maybe even 3 Shining Arcana Gardevoir because it becomes one of your main attackers, or even 3 Gardevoir EX. There might be 1 to 2 Zacian V because now your end game to close out with Zacian V plus Sky Seal Stone is so much more important than anything else. You can choose your draw supporter like I mentioned earlier, Professor Research versus Judge, but I think a lot more lists are adapting to playing 3 to 4 Professor's Research and just going through your deck as quickly as possible. The Recovery supporter is also between Miriam and Clara, and I think that discussion is still up for debate. Some players opt to like the Miriam, which lets you shuffle 5 Pokemon into your deck, or up to 5 Pokemon and draw 3, or playing Clara and just getting the exact pieces back you need for that turn into your hand. The non-Mewtwo V-Union version plays a copy of Cresselia, so they can use the Cresselia to place the damage counters on benched Comfies and take those knockouts against Lost Box. Emergency Jelly has made its way into a couple of lists as well. When you beef up your big Gardevoir, the Brainwave Gardevoir, you can put the Emergency Jelly on and heal it completely back to fresh, so that decks have a difficult time doing damage to it and taking that knockout by not having easy means. Now, the Mewtwo V-Union build requires a little more investment into getting the Mewtwo V-Union into play. It's 4 pieces that you need to be able to discard. Yes, they are free discards throughout the game with refinement, but it is still a commitment of 4 slots and an endgame strategy. Klefki has made its way into a lot of these Mewtwo V-Union builds to buy some time against these Lost Box decks while you are sitting there behind the Klefki. Now, Klefki can also be played in straight Gardevoir, but it is not typically found there, whereas Manaphy is. Peonia is a supporter that needs to be played in the Mewtwo V-Union build because you need to find those Mewtwo pieces to get the combo off towards the end of the game. Close out your last 3 prizes, close out your last 2 prizes, whatever. It's your big end game boss card. Clara versus Miriam, same discussion as before. It could be either one. I think Clara suits this deck better at the Mewtwo V-Union stage, but that's that. The Fear Factor cards are not many for this deck. Gardevoir typically struggles with its own opening hand, and so if you get a playable opening hand into a playable turn 2 where you find your Curlias, you can usually play the game. The scariest part for the deck is Lost Box. Lost Box can ramp up very quickly to get to the Sableye that can use Lost Mine and blow up your board very quickly. Now, if you don't play Manaphy or can't find your Manaphy early enough, Radiant Greninja with its Moonlight Shuriken attack can also blow up your board very quickly, and this deck, unfortunately, its setup cards are also its attackers, so you don't find yourself in the best of situations against a deck like Lost Box, which can really punish your board by just setting up and doing their normal game plan. This is a list that Tord Reklev used to win get second at the European International Championships. You can see that Tord only chose to play 1 copy of the Gardevoir with Shining Arcana, but 2 copies of Zacian V to commit to this strategy. A Mysterious Tail Mew has made its way into the list to help with the early game dig and finding a turn 1 Battle VIP Pass, turn 1 Level Ball, or just continuing to find rare candies and pieces of that nature while setting up. Tord chooses to play a copy of Luminian V to find some of these niche supporters like Roxanne, Judge, Worker, Miriam, as well as Penny. There are situations where you can get board locked because there's a lot of cards that like to board lock you, like a Dreepy or Mawile. And Penny helps you pick that Pokemon up and just continue your game. Penny can also help you pick up a damaged Pokemon like Mew or Cresselia or Zacian to continue cycling them into different attackers and not giving your opponents free prizes towards the end of the game. Tord is choosing to play 4 copies of Professor's Research, a Judge as his draw supporters in the early game, and just relying on getting into those Curlias as quickly as possible. We talked about how the support ball line here is 4 VIP Pass, 4 level, 3 Fog, and 3 Ultra Ball. Tord also sporting a copy of Palpad and 2 copies of Rare Candy to set up, as well as 1 copy of Collapse Stadium to just kind of mitigate any damaged Pokemon on his bench, just throw them into the discard and move forward that way. The second list here we're looking at is a Mewtwo V-Union build that did very well. I think Pedro Pertusi piloted this to a top 16 finish, or top 32 finish, at the European International Championships. As you can see, only 1 copy of Shining Arcana, but the list is much more heavily dedicated to getting these 4 pieces of Mewtwo into the discard. 3 copies of Research, once again very popular here, and Pedro playing cards like Clara and Worker over extra stadium cards. 1 copy of Serena and Boss makes their way into this list, giving this version 2 copies of Gust as opposed to the other version. Now the Serena also acts as a dual-edged sword because in the early game you can discard cards from your hand and fill up your hand to 5. Now, while it might not be the most ideal supporter in a lot of situations, you can see that it may still be useful when you need to actually play the game. Pedro opting to play a copy of Defiance Band to also play from behind with his Mewtwo that can swing into pretty much anything and close out the game at the end of the game with either Super Psysplosion or Final Burn. Now that you've seen 2 looks at Mewtwo V-Union decks, or not Mewtwo V-Union decks, Gardevoir EX decks, we're going to jump into the matchups that these decks have. The Arc Pile deck that Alex Chemensky used to win will become more popular moving forward. So how do we deal with Arceus? Well, the problem isn't the Arceus, it's not the Duraludon. Those are pretty easy to deal with because Sky Seal Stone takes us 3 on Arceus, and Duraludon, if it ever hits the board, is a bunch of free prizes. The Alolan Vulpix V-Star is the problem with its Snow Mirage attack. It reads that Pokemon with abilities cannot damage this, and well, everything in the Gardevoir deck has abilities. If you're playing the non-Mewtwo V-Union build, you have to have the Memory Skip Curlia on a perfect turn to use it on this Alolan Vulpix, and force the deck to have one of their 2 switching outs to come back in and knock it out. Even if they do, you have Miriam or Clara to go back into it once again and force them to find an answer. Now, if you're playing the Mewtwo V-Union build, towards the end of the game, you can go into the Mewtwo V-Union and place 16 damage counters onto the board as you'd like. And if you are in a position where you've taken enough prizes in the early game, this can be a play that can just win you the game. This deck is very fragile, loses to Escape Rope, Path to the Peak, and a couple of the cards that Gardevoir can opt to play, so please keep that in mind moving forward. Arceus pile decks are very susceptible also to the early game Judge, but this list seems to be playing a heavy amount of draw supporters, so you might not stick them as easily. Now, you must assume that I think Lost City will be a prevalent card in these kinds of decks, so just be wary of using your one Shining Arcana Gardevoir in a bad spot that you might want to take a knockout in. Next up, we have Mew VMAX. Mew VMAX comes in 2 flavors, as we discussed in the other Mew VMAX guide. The Path to the Peak version is a little bit scary because Path Judge is a combination that can disrupt any deck and just win games by itself. With 4 Path to the Peak and 3 Judge, the Gardevoir deck might not be able to sustain the early game. If we can survive the early game, the game plan becomes very simple. Knock out 2 Mew VMAXs. Easier said than done. You can also boss a Genesect in the early game, or Sky Seal Stone and take out a knockout on the Mew VMAX in the early game. It's not that difficult to actually close out the game against a Mew VMAX deck, it's just finding your counter stadiums or a way to play the game. You can thin your deck very quickly as Gardevoir, it's just setting up in the early game more than anything. The line is either boss Genesect and close out the game with a 4-price turn, or just damage the Mew VMAX early with your Gardevoir, they can't really one-shot it, then you go into a Brainwave or a Zacian and clean up the game that way. The Fusion Strike build is a little bit trickier because you have to actually deal with the Meloetta or Deoxys that's in the active spot, but doing the 190 with the Gardevoir EX is a lot of damage in the early game and puts your opponent in a little bit of a tricky spot. They have to come up with a Mew VMAX and answer, and you can just boss around, take another Genesect out, and then go for a play on the Mew VMAX. The Sky Seal Stone Zacian play is still probably your best way to win the game, especially against builds like this, but you know that the Fusion Strike build does not typically play heavy Path, 2 at most a lot of the time, so you can be a little bit more at ease that you won't be getting judged every single turn. Next up is Lost Box. This is the turbo version of Lost Box that uses Lost Vacuum and Forest Seal Stone to just power through their deck as quickly as possible and get to a point where they can just blow up your board. Raikou V is a very scary early game attacker because the deck does not have a great answer to it, as Raikou has 200 HP and Gardevoir EX can only hit for 190. Dragonite is not that scary to be honest, but Raikou V paired with early Greninja pressure can be a lot of things to deal with. If your opponent ramps up to a Sableye early enough, they can pop your Manaphy, forcing you to find your Clara or Miriam immediately and putting it back into play. If not, a Moonlight Shuriken that's timely can just destroy your board and put you in an awkward position to close out the game. This is probably the deck's toughest matchup because of how quickly they can ramp up to 7 Pokemon into the Lost Zone, or not Pokemon, 7 cards into the Lost Zone, and just start gutting your board. And like I said, unfortunately, your draw engine is also your Pokemon attacker engine, and Lost Box preys on picking off these small engines very well. This being the trickiest matchup, obviously you want to be able to use your Penny to good effect to pick up your damaged attackers. Use the Cresselia when they attack with Cramorant and stick it in the active to start sniping off the Comfeys on the bench while leaving the Cramorant in the active and using your Judges or even Judge or 1 to 2 Judges in the early game to good effect. In the late game, Roxanne is just simply amazing and you have to just kind of hope that Roxanne can pull you through the edge. If you're playing Klefki's in your deck, you can use Klefki to just kind of do a lot of damage in the early game and hope your opponents don't find their choruses naturally. If you're not and you're playing the Mewtwo V-Union build, in the late game you want to Roxanne and bring your Mewtwo out, popping 2 Comfeys and hopefully closing out the game in 2 turns from there. Your opponent can always find Drapion plus double Mirage Gate to kind of close out the game, but it's highly unlikely to do it with Roxanne to 2 when you're killing 2 Comfeys and they probably have something like a Sableye in the active spot. The next build of Lost Box was the Sablezard build. This one's a little bit trickier as well because they can go through the deck very quickly, and Mawile with the tempting trap attack can stick you in the active. Miltank's Miracle Body is a little bit difficult to deal with, or so you think, because it's only for Pokemon V, which doesn't stop anything in our deck. Now, Radiant Zard does do a ton of damage, so you have to be very wary of the 250 that can come at you. So attaching energies from your discard has to be done in a calculated tactical manner, so you're not giving your opponent free prizes. Because in the process, we are damaging ourselves, which, well, Sableye decks are going to be licking their lips at. This deck will also ramp up very quickly to their 7, or even to their 10, which is what their game plan is, and you're going to have to try to avoid all of this. This deck is a little bit more susceptible to Roxanne because they need to find copies of their Clara towards the end of the game, and they also have copies of Echoing Horns, so you need to be very, very wary of that. This is also a very tough matchup, but I think it's a little more winnable than the Turbo build that can run to the Greninja and do a ton of damage. Goodra is probably the most winnable version of the Lost Box matchup because Goodra has, well, it's a 2-prizer that can become a 3-prizer with the Sky Seal Stone. You can always hunt early Comfies and do the exact same thing with the Cresselia and hunt the bench. The big thing about the Goodra lists that is a little bit tricky to deal with is the Articuno. Wild Freeze Articuno hits perfectly into your board for 70 and paralyzes you. And at that point, well, Articuno will lock up something to the point where the Goodra will come up, take a prize, buy the turn they need, and win the game off the back of that. If you go in with something like Zacian, you do have the penny to pick it back up, but if you go in with Zacian, the Goodra will probably just take a knockout on you anyway, because that's your best attacker to close out a game against a Goodra. In the early game, you can use the Brainwave Arcana, Shining Arcana Gardevoir to just bring things up, pop them, put a ton of pressure on with Judges, but keep in mind that this deck still can set up and be a little bit of a problem. Any form of Lost Box is a little bit tricky, but I think this is the best one that you have a chance of beating. Next up, we have Lugia, the traditional Lugia build with 2 Tyranitars, a Stonjourner, and an Yveltal. A little bit scary because there's a lot of dark types if you haven't noticed, and we are weak to dark. But with Temple of Sinnoh, as well as Sky Seal Stone, we have a very good shot in these matchups. You kind of need to use your Temple of Sinnohs 1 to 2 if you play them wisely to deal with the V-Guard energies and the gift energies that this deck plays. You can put them in a really awkward position by taking a knockout and judging them, by putting them at a very few cards in their hand. This deck now traditionally loses a lot of ways to find the pieces it has, and if Tyranitar is attacking with its second attack to clean up your Gardevoir EX, which is something you need to be very, very wary of, they're going to be losing a lot of resources. They can also use this baby Yveltal to set it up and get in there. It's probably their best attacker in the early game against you, and they shouldn't be using Lugia, but a lot of decks will use their Lugia against you and do a ton of damage, which sets you up for a Sky Seal Stone play to take 3 prize cards at some point in the game. Using something for like 10 damage, like a Joust with your Klefki, or even your Mew, can put them in a little bit of a precarious position, because that means 1 less energy card is required for you to one-shot their board. Lugia is probably one of the most straightforward matchups because it's just a giant slugfest. You're just both swinging at each other, and well, Lugia doesn't want to judge in the early game, so you can set up behind your Curlias pretty comfortably. It's all about the early turns, it's all about setting up, and that's where the matchup comes down to. They can get lucky with their Cragalanches, but hopefully they don't. The little bit of a more, I guess, better matchup is a Lugia Duraludon version because they're committing resources to their Skyscraper Duraludon, which is terrible, terrible, terrible against you in the matchup. Now, they do play Thornton, which lets them get back into an Yveltal or a Tyranitar or something, so you have to be very careful of them going into 2 Yveltals throughout the game. But the Duraludon does absolutely nothing to you. You can set up and just put a lot of pressure on them. In the late game, be very cognizant of the Tyranitar or Yveltal when you go into the Mewtwo if you choose to go that build, but the matchup, again, like I mentioned, it's a gigantic slugfest, and it's a resource war. And Lugia has to use a lot of resources to kind of go through your board, and you, at some point, will not have to do that. One technique to use in the Lugia matchup is make sure you get 2 basic energies onto your Brainwave Arcana, Shining Arcana, Brainwave Gardevoir, naturally without using the Gardevoir EX's ability, because 8 is the magic number to knock out a lot of things in this deck. That's your key. Next up, we have Miraidon. Miraidon, I think, is the final deck in our list of decks to look at because Miraidon is a little bit of a outlier, aggressive deck, just kind of gets in there, does a lot of damage. Miraidon can put a lot of pressure on you early, but I think if they're not playing the Magnezone V-Star version, you're not under any threat of having your board nuked because they can't drag up the Manaphy into blowing up 2 Curlias, and you can eventually race them with your Brainwave Gardevoirs. You can always trade 2 for 1 and kind of just outlast their onslaught. And with a Regieleki VMAX in the bench, you can always close out the game with a Boss, Sky Seal Stone, Zacian play to take 4 prize cards, which those 4 prize cards aren't going anywhere because Regieleki VMAX sits on the bench. Hopefully, this is a very useful guide for you guys who are about to play Gardevoir EX into this new format. And if you please enjoyed this, please, please, please like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. And until next time, in the next matchup guide, let me know in the comments below what deck you want to see next and what matchup guide you want to see coming up. Thank you guys. Peace out.